The mist came up off the river at Colby Ferry before the sun did, and it brought with it the smell of wet stone and boiled linen and the chrysanthemums someone had cut too early and left standing in a bucket by the kitchen door. By 7 the smell of beeswax had joined them, because every table in Wrendale Hall that could take a polish was getting one, and every candle that could be lit for testing was lit, and then snuffed again. It was the morning of the Michaelmas presentation, the one day of the year the village girls of an age to marry were brought before the Duke and his household, and the house had been readying itself since Tuesday. Clara Finch was not one of the girls being presented. She was the kind of woman a room forgot the moment she left it, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago. She was 23, the daughter of a curate who had died owing more than he had ever earned, and she had one skill the parish agreed she possessed without argument. She could mend anything made of cloth so that the mend did not show. She had mended the altar cloth, the miller's wife's good shawl, and half the linen at Wrendale Hall, and she did it in a small cold room off the laundry court for wages that kept her and her brother Tom in bread and, when the winter was hard, in coal. Tom was 8, and he had been coughing since August. It was not yet the kind of cough that frightened her. It was the kind that made her listen at his door before she slept, which was nearly the same thing. She had walked to the hall before light, because there was hemming to finish before the guests arrived, and because the walk gave her 20 minutes in which no one required anything of her. The lane was quiet. A rook called once from the church tower, and then did not call again. She did not know it yet, but before the candles in the great hall were lit for the evening, someone at Wrendale would need her, and it would not be anyone she expected, and it would not be for anything she would ever be thanked for properly. She let herself in at the laundry court and set to work. The gown on her table that morning belonged to no one she knew, a green silk overskirt sent down from London that needed its hem taken up an inch, and she worked it in small, exact stitches, the kind her mother had taught her before her mother died, the kind that did not show from the right side no matter how closely a person looked. She had strong hands for a woman who was not strong anywhere else. Red across the knuckles from cold water, steady. She did not think of herself as pretty, because no one had ever given her reason to, and she did not think of herself as unfortunate either, because self-pity was a coin she had decided long ago not to spend. She thought of herself, when she thought of herself at all, as a woman who mended things. It was not much of a definition. It was the one she had. By 9 the house had filled with the particular chaos of a great occasion, footmen carrying chairs that did not need carrying, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, moving through it all like a woman walking through weather she had seen many times before. She found Clara at her table near 10, and stood in the doorway a moment before she spoke. "They'll want you upstairs before noon," she said. Miss Amory's flounce came unstitched at the fitting, and nobody trusts Peters with silk that fine. Clara did not look up from her needle. "I'll go when I've finished this. You'll go now. The hem can wait." Miss Amory cannot. She is already in a temper, and a temper in that girl before noon does not improve by 1 o'clock. Clara set her needle down, because Mrs. Pruitt was rarely wrong about anything, and gathered her basket, and went up the back stair into a house that was not, strictly, hers to walk through, though by now she knew every crooked board in it. She did not know, climbing that stair, that the Duke of Wrendale had come down from London 2 days early and told no one below the steward, and that he was at that hour standing in his own gallery in a plain brown coat, looking at portraits of men who had spent their money loudly, and asking himself, not for the first time, whether he meant to be one of them. She did not know it. She had no reason to. It would be some time yet before she learned that the man in the plain coat had watched more of that day than anyone below stairs ever guessed, and that what he watched, before an hour had passed, would decide a great deal more than either of them yet understood. The robing room set aside for the young ladies being presented smelled of orris powder and hot iron, and underneath that of nerves, which have a smell of their own, if enough of them are gathered in one room. 6 girls were dressing, mothers and maids moving among them like bees who had lost the thread of the hive, and in the middle of it stood Miss Cordelia Amory, cousin to the Duke on his mother's side, examining her own reflection with the particular patience of a woman who has never doubted the reflection would reward her for it. Cordelia was handsome in the way that money makes handsome easier, and she had a laugh she used the way other people used a fan, 3 practised beats, light as a bell, that she produced whenever she wished to be seen finding something amusing. She had not asked for Clara. She had asked for Peters, and been told Peters could not be spared, and had said, loudly enough for the room, that it was a poor sort of house that sent a curate's daughter to dress a duke's own cousin, but there it was. Clara said nothing to that. She had learned in 3 years of mending other women's clothes that the ones who said such things wanted an answer even less than they wanted the mend. It happened while she was still threading her needle. Cordelia turned too quickly toward the glass. Her heel caught the edge of a low stool no one had moved out of the way in time, and the sound that followed was not loud, only final, the particular tearing hiss of good silk giving way along a seam it had never been meant to bear weight on. The hem of her gown, the whole of the underskirt on the left side, hung loose from waist to floor in a long pale wound. There was a silence of the kind that has weight. One of the younger girls laughed once and stopped herself. A mother somewhere murmured that there was simply no time. The carriages were due within the hour. Someone would have to say she was unwell. Cordelia stood very still in the middle of the room, with her face going the colour of the underside of a leaf, and for one moment, the only moment anyone present would later remember her looking anything but certain of herself, she looked like a girl of 17 who has torn her gown and has nowhere to hide it. She did not ask Clara for help. She would not have asked Clara for water if she were on fire. It was Clara who set down the green silk she had been sent up to mend, and knelt without a word to anyone on the floor at Cordelia Amory's feet, and began to pin. She worked the way she always worked, quick and without flourish, her mouth full of pins the way her mother's had always been. And she did not once look up to see who in the room was watching her do it. That was, though she never knew it, and never would have thought to wonder, the whole of what made it worth watching. She was not performing kindness for an audience. She had simply seen a thing torn, and a clock running out, and hands that could mend it, and she had gone down on her knees on a cold floor, without waiting to be asked, and without any hope, or wish, of being thanked. The door to that room stood a hand's width open, because someone had propped it for the light, and in the gap of it, unremarked by a room full of women too occupied to notice a plain brown coat, the Duke of Rendale stood and watched a woman he did not yet know mend, in 11 minutes, on her knees, without a single word of complaint, the gown of the one cousin in his household who had never once been kind to her. She did not know then that the man in the doorway was the Duke. She did not know that he would remember, longer than he remembered almost anything else that year, the particular way she had bitten off the thread with her teeth rather than reach for scissors, because reaching for scissors would have cost 10 more seconds, and the carriages were due. She did not know that he had come to that gallery, a man half convinced that Rendale Hall had nothing left in it worth his staying for. and that he would leave that doorway, a man no longer certain of that at all. She only knew that the hem held, that Cordelia Amory turned back to her glass without a word, and that somewhere below a clock was already striking the half-hour. Cordelia examined the mend in the glass for a long moment. She turned once, twice, watching the fall of the silk. "It will do," she said at last, to her own reflection rather than to Clara. Clara gathered her pins into her palm and stood, her knees stiff from the cold floor, and said only, "I'm glad of it," and went back to fetch the green silk she had left on the window seat. Because Miss Amory's temper was not, in the end, the reason she had knelt, and it was not owed anything further now that the work was done. "You might have let Peters be sent for," Cordelia said, not quite looking at her. "There wasn't time." No, a pause. No, there wasn't. It was, Clara thought, walking back down the servants' stair with the green silk over her arm, the nearest thing to a thank you she was ever likely to get from that quarter, and she did not mind it, because she had not kneeled on that floor hoping for one. The man in the plain brown coat did not follow her down. He stood a while longer in the gallery among the loud portraits of his ancestors, turning over in his mind a thing he could not yet name, and when his steward found him 20 minutes later to ask about the seating for supper, he answered the question and asked one of his own, off-hand, as though it hardly mattered. The young woman mending upstairs, the dark-haired one, not one of the young ladies. Who is she? Miss Finch, your Grace, the curate's daughter. She mends for the house. Does she? The Duke said, and let the matter drop, though he did not, in fact, let it drop at all. The presentation went forward that evening exactly as it had been planned for a month. 6 girls brought down the great staircase in order of their father's consequence. 6 curtsies, 6 introductions, candlelight enough to make even plain girls look well. Cordelia Amory was, by every account given afterward in the village, the handsomest woman in the room, and no one but Clara Finch and a man in a doorway would ever know how near she had come to not being in that room at all. Clara was not in the great hall to see any of it. She had finished the green silk by 6 and gone home to Tom, who was coughing worse than he had the night before, and she sat up with him until the coughing eased, and did not think again that night about pins or hems or doorways. She did not know that within a week a doctor she had never sent for would knock at her door, saying only that his fee had already been settled by the parish relief fund, and that he had been asked, very particularly, not to give her the name of the man who had arranged it. The doctor came on a Thursday, and Clara nearly turned him away at the door, because she had not sent for him, and had no shillings to spare for one she had not sent for. He was a mild, patient man named Hale, who had tended half the village for 30 years, and he told her, standing on her step with his bag in hand, that the fee was already settled through the parish relief, that he had merely been asked to call, and that he would rather examine the boy than argue in the cold. She let him in because Tom's cough had not eased in 3 days, and because arguing with a doctor already paid for seemed a poor economy of pride. He listened at Tom's chest a long while, and pronounced it a chill sitting too near the lungs, not yet the worst thing she had feared, and left a bottle of something bitter with instructions to keep the boy warm and dry, and off the flagstones. Who arranged this? Clara asked him at the door, if it wasn't the parish board itself. I know every name on that board, and none of them has called on me in a year. I was asked not to say, Hale told her, only that I was to call, and not to trouble you for payment, and not to make a great matter of it. He settled his hat. There are worse mysteries than a free doctor, Miss Finch. I'd let this one lie. She could not let it lie, not entirely, though she said nothing more of it to anyone. She turned the puzzle over for days the way she turned a hem over to find where the thread had knotted, and found no answer that satisfied her, and in the meantime Tom's cough eased, and the coal bin at the end of the lane, which she had been rationing since October, seemed somehow never quite to run as low as her sums said it should. She did not connect any of it to a torn hem, or a doorway, or a man in a plain brown coat she had never so much as looked at directly. Why would she? She had done what she did that morning for no reason beyond the reason itself, and she had put it out of her mind within the hour, the way she put most things out of her mind that she did not expect to be repaid for. At Rendale Hall, the Duke gave an order to Mrs. Pruitt within the same week, phrased carefully enough that it sounded like nothing more than sense. The State Gallery's old tapestries, 3 generations neglected, wanted mending before the winter damp got further into them, and the house's usual woman, Peters, had not the patience for close work of that kind. Did Mrs. Pruitt know of anyone? Mrs. Pruitt, who had run that house for 2 dukes and buried a husband and never once in 30 years been fooled by a man pretending a thing mattered less than it did, said that she believed Miss Finch might answer, if His Grace didn't mind a slow hand for careful work. A slow hand is precisely what careful work wants, the Duke said, and did not meet her eye when he said it, which told Mrs. Pruitt everything she needed to know, and nothing she intended to say aloud. So it was that Clara Finch came to spend 3 mornings a week in the long gallery of Rendale Hall through the last of that autumn, seated on a low stool by a window with better light than her own cold room could give her, working a needle through cloth 200 years old while. More often than either of them would have admitted planning, the Duke of Rendale found some reason to be in the gallery himself. He was not, in those early weeks, a man who talked easily. He asked her questions in the manner of a man unused to asking questions of anyone below his own rank, and expecting an honest answer, and was visibly, if quietly, surprised each time he got one. "You don't flinch when a thread snaps," he said once, watching her work a tear along a hunting scene, a stag caught mid-stride for 2 centuries now. Most women I have watched at needlework treat a snapped thread like a small tragedy. "It isn't a tragedy," Clara said, not looking up. "It's a thread. You knot it and go on. And if the whole cloth were rotten, if it kept tearing no matter how well you knotted it, then you'd know the cloth, not the thread, was the trouble, and you'd stop wasting good thread on it." She glanced up then, briefly. Was that a question about the tapestry, "Your Grace," or about something else? He did not answer that directly, which she took, correctly, for an answer of its own. He told her, in pieces, over those mornings, more than he had told most people in London in a year, that his father had died believing charity shown openly was charity spent twice, once on the giving, and once on being seen to give, and that a man who wanted credit for kindness had not, in his father's reckoning, been kind at all, only vain in a slower coin, that he had learned the lesson too well, and now did a great deal of good he told no one about, not from his father's coldness, but from a stubbornness that had outlived it. That he had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman who wept beautifully in front of his mother, and had, within the same fortnight, dismissed a housemaid without wages over a broken vase the housemaid had not broken. He did not say much more about her than that. He did not need to. "I have wondered since," he said, "whether a person's true character only shows itself in a room they believe is empty of anyone who matters." Clara considered that. Her needle paused mid-stitch. "I think that's likely true," she said, though I couldn't say from experience. No one's ever thought a room was empty of me. I'm not the sort of person a room needs to be empty for. He looked at her for a long moment after that, in a way she did not understand, and did not try very hard to. The first real cruelty came at the end of November, at a small supper the Duke gave for his neighbours. One Clara had no business attending, and did not attend, except that she had been asked to deliver the mended gallery cloth that evening rather than wait for morning, and arrived at the side door just as the company was moving through the hall to the dining room. Cordelia Amory saw her first. She was on the Duke's arm, having arranged, with the particular skill of a woman long practised at arranging such things, to be seated beside him, and she stopped in the hall doorway when she saw Clara standing there, with a folded tapestry in her arms, and her plain grey cloak still damp from the walk. "Good heavens," Cordelia said, to the company generally, her laugh arriving on cue. 3 light beats. It's the little mending girl. Cousin, you have her running errands at supper hour now. What next? Will she carve the goose? A ripple of soft amusement went through the hall. The kind, polite people produce when a hostess wishes them to. Clara stood still, the tapestry heavy in her arms, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not simply feed the moment further. Your hands, Cordelia went on, warming to it now, nodding at Clara's reddened knuckles. I do wonder you're not ashamed to be seen with them at a gentleman's table, though I suppose one can hardly be ashamed of what one cannot help. I'm not ashamed of my hands, Clara said, quietly, and it was the first thing she had said. They've done more honest work than most hands in this hall tonight, mine included in that company, only because I'm standing in it. The silence that followed was not the kind produced on cue. Cordelia's smile thinned. Somewhere behind her, a gentleman coughed in a way that was mostly laughter poorly disguised. Miss Finch delivers the gallery work at my request, the Duke said into the quiet, in a voice that was not raised and did not need to be. At whatever hour it is finished. I would take it as a discourtesy to me, cousin, if she were made unwelcome at my own door for doing what I asked of her. Cordelia's colour rose, but she said nothing further, and the company moved on into supper as though nothing at all had happened, which is how such rooms generally manage such moments. Clara set the tapestry down with Mrs. Prowett, and left by the same door she had come in, and did not cry on the walk home, though her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady until she was well past the gate. She had trained herself a long time ago, not to weep where it showed. She had not entirely trained herself out of shaking. The Duke found her 3 days later in the gallery, and said nothing at all about the supper, only set a small parcel on the window-seat beside her, wrapped in plain paper. I don't want it thought I'm buying your silence about my cousin's manners, he said. I only thought your hands might want something warmer than they have. She unwrapped it slowly. A pair of gloves, good wool, plain, exactly the sort a working woman could wear without comment from anyone. I can't accept these, Your Grace. You can. I'm not offering them as a gift you owe anything for. Consider them wages for cold work, if it eases you to think of it that way. A pause. Though I'd rather you simply took them. She took them, in the end, because refusing them a second time would have made more of the matter than the matter deserved, and she wore them on the walk home that evening, and did not examine too closely why her chest felt tight the whole way. The winter that followed was, on its surface, uneventful. The tapestries were finished by January. The gloves were worn thin at the fingers from use, and darned by Clara's own hand rather than replaced, because that was the sort of woman she was. Tom's cough did not return. The coal held out. If Clara noticed that her small store of good fortune that winter never seemed quite explained by her own wages, she noticed it the way a person notices weather, gratefully, without asking too hard where it came from, because asking felt obscurely like tempting it to stop. It was Cordelia in the end who forced the question that could not go on being unasked. She came upon Clara in early February in the lane below the church, not by accident, Clara understood later, but by design, having watched for her. "You think it's affection," Cordelia said, without any preamble at all, "that gets you gloves and a gallery to sit in, and a doctor sent round for your brother without a bill. It isn't, it's guilt, or it's pity, or it's a rich man amusing himself before the season starts and he remembers what's owed to his name. I've seen it before. I watched it happen to a girl in Bath who thought a gentleman's kindness meant something, and I watched what was left of her after it stopped meaning it. Clara's hands, inside the darned gloves, went very still. Is that meant to be kindness? Telling me that. It's meant to be true. Cordelia's voice had none of its usual bright cruelty in it now, only something flatter, almost tired. He will marry where his name requires him to marry. He has always known that, and so, I think, do you, if you'll be honest with yourself for once, instead of mending things that were never yours to mend. She walked on before Clara could answer, which was, Clara thought afterward, the cruellest part of it, that Cordelia had not stayed to hear whether there was an answer at all. Clara did not go back to the gallery the next morning, or the morning after. She sent word by a boy from the village that her brother needed her at home, which was not, strictly, a lie, though it was not, strictly, the whole truth either. She sat at her own table in her own cold room, and told herself, with the particular firmness of a woman used to telling herself hard things, that whatever had been growing in that gallery through the winter had grown out of pity and proximity and nothing sturdier, and that the kindest thing she could do, for herself, and for a duke who owed his name better than a curate's daughter, was to let it end quietly, without either of them having to say so aloud. She wrote him a note in the second week, short and plain, thanking him for the work and the wages, and explaining that her brother's health required her closer attention at home, and that she would not be able to return to the gallery that season. She did not mention the gloves. She did not mention Cordelia. She sealed it, and sent it by the same boy, and told herself she had done the sensible thing, and sat by her own cold fire that night with her hands, for once, not steady at all. Mrs. Pruitt came to Clara's door herself, 3 days after the note, which she had never once done in 3 years of Clara working at the Hall, and stood in the small front room turning her bonnet strings in her hands, as though she were not entirely certain she ought to have come. "He hasn't been to the gallery since your note arrived," she said, without preamble, "nor eaten a proper supper that I can tell. I don't say that to lay a burden on you, Miss Finch. I say it because I think you've been told something by someone in that house that wasn't the whole truth, and I think you're too fair-minded a woman to make a decision on half of it. I don't know what you mean. I think you do." Mrs. Pruitt sat, uninvited, in the chair by the cold hearth, and folded her hands. "I've kept a good many of that man's secrets in 30 years, Miss Finch, and I'll break exactly one of them today, because I think it's owed to you more than it's owed to him. The doctor that came for your Tom in October, the coal that never ran as low as it should have, the gloves. None of that was the parish fund, and none of it was chance. It was him. Every shilling of it, and he asked me particularly each time not to let his name near it. Clara sat very still. "He does it for half the parish," Mrs. Pruitt went on. "Has done for years since his father died, though his father would have called it weakness to be caught at. Roofs mended on cottages that never knew who mended them. A boy sent to a good school in the next county, whose mother thinks a benevolent society paid for it. There's no ledger of it that shows his name, not one line, because he asked that there never be. I only know because I keep his household accounts, and a woman who keeps a man's accounts for 30 years learns to read what isn't written in them as well as what is." "Why?" Clara said, when she trusted her voice again. "Why not let it be known? It would do him credit. That's precisely why not, I should think, though you'd want to ask him that yourself." Mrs. Pruitt rose, resettling her bonnet. "I'll say one more thing and then I'll leave you to your fire. Whatever Miss Amory told you in that lane, and I know she told you something, because she told the upper housemaid something similar just to watch it travel. I'd weigh it against a doctor who came without a bill before I weighed it against her word. That's all. I'm not paid to give advice on matters of the heart, Miss Finch, only on matters of coal and linen. But I'll give it anyway, since it's cost me nothing but the walk." She left Clara sitting by her cold hearth with a great deal to think about, and the beginnings, though she would not yet have called it that, of a small stubborn warmth she had not let herself feel since the lane below the church. She went back to Wrendale Hall 2 mornings later, not to the gallery but to the front door, which she had never once used in 3 years, and asked the footman, in a voice steadier than she felt, whether his Grace was at home. He was. He received her in his study, a small warm room with a fire built up high against the last of the February cold, and he stood when she entered in a way that told her, before either of them said a word, that he had not expected her to come at all, and had been hoping for it regardless. "Mrs. Pruitt told you?" he said. "She told me some of it. I think she left the rest for you to tell, if you meant to tell it." He did not sit, and neither did she. He stood by the fire with his hands loosely clasped behind him, the way a man stands when he has rehearsed a thing and finds, now that the moment has come, that the rehearsal is no use to him at all. "I watched you mend my cousin's hem," he said in October, before the presentation. "I don't know if you ever knew I was there. I stood in a doorway in a coat no one would have looked at twice, and I watched you go down on a cold floor for a woman who had never once shown you a kindness, and mend her in 11 minutes without once looking up to see if anyone of consequence was watching. I have thought about that morning more than I have thought about anything in a very long while." "I didn't know," Clara said. "I didn't know you were there at all. I know, that's the whole of why it mattered." He turned to face her fully then. "My father taught me that any kindness a person performs while they believe themselves watched by someone who matters isn't proof of anything, only performance. I have spent a great many years testing people against that measure without telling them I was doing it, and nearly every one of them failed it, not because they were unkind, but because they were only kind when it was seen. You were not performing for anyone that morning. You could not have been, because you had no notion I existed. That is the only test I have ever trusted, and you passed it without knowing you were being examined at all. That's not a very flattering reason to fall in love with someone," Clara said, before she had entirely decided to say it, being tested. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the kind of near smile that on a graver man counts as an event. "No, it isn't. I'd rather tell you the truth of it plainly than dress it up as something prettier than it was. I watched you first because I wished to know what you were, when you thought no one who mattered could see you. I have gone on watching since, for reasons that have nothing to do with testing at all. And the doctor, the coal, the gloves. Those weren't tests, he said. Those were only wanting you and your brother warm, and not knowing how to say so without frightening you off with it, so I said nothing instead, which I understand now was its own kind of cowardice. He drew a slow breath. I am telling you all of it today, Miss Finch, because I would rather you refuse me honestly than accept me on half the truth, the way my cousin very nearly persuaded you to do. She told me you'd marry where your name required. My cousin has spent a great deal of energy this winter arranging for me to marry where my name requires, chiefly because she has hoped for some time to be the one my name required. A dryness entered his voice. I have disappointed her in that hope rather thoroughly, and I mean to go on disappointing her. Clara looked at him a long moment, her hands, in the darned gloves, finely steady. I won't ask you to answer me today, he said, before she could speak at all. I would rather have your no honestly given in a month than your yes tonight, because you feel the moment requires one of you. Take the gloves off, if it eases you, and think on it by your own fire instead of mine. I am not offering you a rescue, Miss Finch. I have provisions enough of my own without needing to be thanked for them, and I would rather you married me for reasons that had nothing to do with coal. What reasons would those be in your accounting? Clara asked. I couldn't say. I only know I would rather hear you say them yourself, freely, than have them handed to you by me, or by anyone. She looked down at her hands. She drew one glove off, finger by finger, slowly, the wool soft and worn thin at the seams from a winter's wear, and set it on the small table between them. I don't need a month, she said. You should take it regardless. I don't want it. She drew off the second glove and set it beside the first, and her bare hand, when she held it out to him, was entirely steady. I have spent 3 years mending other people's things, and being told, plainly or otherwise, that I was not owed the asking of my own mind on any matter of consequence. You're the first person who has ever offered to let me answer freely and meant it. I don't intend to waste that by pretending I need a month to know my own heart. He crossed the small distance between them and took her bare hand in both of his, and did not kiss it at once, only held it, as though the holding itself were the thing he had wanted longest. Say it plainly, then, he said. I find I'd rather hear it plain than pretty. Yes, she said. It was the only word she needed, and it was, she found, entirely enough. He raised her hand then, and kissed it, once, gravely, the way a man kisses a promise rather than a prize, and outside the study window a rook called once from the bare trees along the drive, and did not call again. The wedding, when it came in April, was smaller than Rendale Hall had seen in 2 generations, at the Duke's own particular wish, though a duke's smallness is still a good deal larger than most weddings the village had ever known, and the church bells rang the whole afternoon, regardless of how many guests had been asked. Cordelia Amory was not among them. She had removed to a distant aunt's household in Bath within the month, at an invitation that had been, by every account, more firmly urged than freely offered, and word came back only rarely, and always second-hand, and always, by the account of it, a little more subdued than the Cordelia the village remembered. Mr. Hale the doctor came, and cried openly through the vows, which surprised no one who knew him. Mrs. Pruitt came, and did not cry, though she used her handkerchief a great deal more than the dust of the church could account for. Tom, who had grown 2 inches and lost his cough entirely by that spring, stood at the front in a new coat that fit him, and looked, the whole ceremony through, as though he could not quite believe his own good fortune, which was, in its way, exactly right, because none of them quite could. A year later, on an evening in early autumn, when the mist was coming up off the river again, just as it had the morning of the presentation, Clara sat by the fire in the small warm study that had once been the Duke's alone, and was now simply theirs, a pair of old gloves, hers, mended so many times the original wool was hardly half of what remained, folded on the table beside her because she had never been able to bring herself to throw them out. Gideon sat across from her with a letter from Bath he had not yet opened, and their hands, when he reached across the space between the two chairs, found each other without either of them needing to look, and did not let go. Mrs. Pruitt tells me my cousin has written asking after the child, he said at last, setting the letter aside unread. I confess I don't know what to make of that. Read it, then. You needn't decide what to make of it tonight. He set it aside anyway, for another evening, and turned his attention instead to the fire, and to the woman beside him whose hand he did not release, and outside once. A rook called from the bare beginning of the trees, and was still. She had knelt once on a cold floor, for a woman who owed her nothing and would give her nothing in return, and had not known, kneeling there, that she was watched, or that being watched, unbeknownst to her, was the whole of what made the moment true. It was, she thought sometimes still, by that fire, the oddest foundation a marriage had ever been built on, an hour, a hem, a doorway left open a hand's width for the light. But foundations are rarely chosen for their grandness. They are chosen because they hold. A person's true worth is never what they perform for a room that is watching. It is only, ever, what they do for the room they believe is empty.